Using archive footage and new interviews now on BBC One, a reconstruction of the dramatic events that led to the last hanging of a woman in Britain. Ruth Ellis, A Life for a Life.
I just have an overwhelming and uncontrollable desire to kill him. There's nothing else for it. I somehow feel outside of myself. In a daze. I don't care about the law. I'll die for it.
David! Get out of the way, Clive!
In cold blood, Ruth Ellis had shot her lover David Blakely dead with a revolver. They'd been lovers for 18 months. The law was clear. If Ruth Ellis was found guilty, she would suffer the death penalty.
You can sit down there, they won't be long. Can we get you a cup of tea while you wait?
An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. I'm going to hang for this.
Don't say that, Ruth. If you get a good barrister, you won't.
Ruth Ellis's case became a sensation. The hacks had a tale which was beyond their wildest dreams. The shooting by a glamorous model from a poor background of her lover, an adulterous upper-class racing driver, and the prospect of a hanging. Class, sex and death. The perfect story.
She always admitted to have lived what she called a bad life, I believe, or what I think she called it. It was a drinking club life at that time. She'd never pretended she was a saintly person at all.
Ruth Ellis's lawyers knew that it would be difficult to save her from the gallows. Her junior barrister, Peter Rawlinson, who went on to become Attorney General, met her at a hearing to set the trial date. A tricky case was about to become almost impossible.
It's all relatively straightforward. The judges checked all the details. So, the court date's been set for the 14th of June.
4 more weeks.
Yes.
You will make certain, won't you, that I shall be hanged? That is the only way I can join him.
You can't talk like that.
I want to join him. I want to join him.
You mustn't think that.
She didn't look at all like her pictures in the newspaper. Her hair was no longer blonde, the dye was growing out. She hadn't bothered at all with her appearance. I was so surprised because she was completely sort of in control, and she was completely matter-of-fact, and she made this, what I've thought, the most terrible statement to me.
Ruth Ellis entered a plea of not guilty. Crowds streamed to the Old Bailey, queuing for seats.
It was very tense always when there was a capital murder case, especially with a woman, and especially a woman who looked like she did at this time, and the interest there had been in the press and so on. So it was very tense and very dramatic, and people crowded. The court, of course, absolutely crowded. And it had all the elements of a sensational case.
Ruth Ellis faced a formidable prosecution team led by Christmas Humphreys, who'd prosecuted some of the most notorious hangings of the period. He was a particularly effective and theatrical operator. Opposing him one of the Old Bailey's top silks, Melford Stevenson. It was set to be a classic battle. Although worryingly for the defence, the jury were 10 men and only 2 women, they could draw some comfort that the judge was Mr. Justice Havers, not known as a hanging judge.
The idea of her pleading not guilty, even though she wanted, as she told me, to be hanged, therefore to be convicted, the logic of that was that she would at least get out her story, get out as much of her story as she wanted to tell, or as she was prepared to tell. I don't think she was probably now prepared to tell all the story, but what she wanted to say. In other words, she would have her hour or so in court that she wanted the world to know, having read about all the things that were said about it in the newspapers.
Ruth Ellis made a dazzling entrance. Her hair had been freshly bleached. This was not the image of a vulnerable woman, more that of a cold-blooded killer. Ironically, we have discovered her prison makeover was the defence's idea, and probably their first mistake. Her solicitor, John Bickford, had specifically asked Melford Stevenson whether it was legally possible to force the prison authorities to let Ruth bring in a hairdresser, or at least the chemicals necessary to dye her hair.
If your lordship pleases. The members of the jury, you will hear a sad story, which I'm not going to tell you now.
The defence decided to concentrate on the dreadful way David Blakely had treated her. They didn't do a very good job.
It's always an unpleasant thing to say anything disagreeable about someone who is dead. But I venture to think that the story she will unfold to you can leave no doubt in your minds that he was a most unpleasant person.
For the prosecution, it was simpler. Christmas Humphrey's aim was deadly accurate. Her answer to his single question was to seal her fate.
Mrs. Ellis, when you fired that revolver at close range into the body of David Blakely, what did you intend to do?
It was obvious when I shot him I intended to kill him.
Very dramatic, tense. It's like a sort of rustle of paper or wind through a court when that happens. It makes a great sort of movement. You could hear it, always touch it. A sort of shock, really.
The defence were trying to show that Blakely had so provoked Ruth that in the end she killed him.
Before you address the jury, it would be as well if we had a short discussion as to the law. And the jury, of course, will not be interested in that.
But in the eyes of the law, Blakely's abusive behaviour was irrelevant, so Melford Stevenson attempted a desperate and ambitious ploy. He tried to persuade the judge to change the law.
Does your proposition come to this, putting it in its most simple form, that if a man associates with a woman and then he leaves her suddenly and does not communicate with her, and she is a jealous woman, emotionally disturbed, and then goes out and shoots him, that is sufficient ground for the jury to reduce the crime of murder to manslaughter?
I would, of course, add a very large number of facts to what your lordship has put.
I was asking if that would be enough, in your view.
In my submission, there is enough for it to be left to the jury.
The judge ruled against the defence, so Melford Stevenson lost his chance to argue directly to the jury that Ruth Ellis was provoked. He couldn't even make a speech to them, begging mercy.
My lord, in view of the ruling which your lordship has just announced, it is desirable, perhaps, that I should say in the presence and hearing of the jury that I cannot now with propriety address the jury at all, because it would be impossible for me to do so without inviting the jury to disregard your lordship's ruling. And in those circumstances, I feel that I can do no more.
So there was nothing to be said, because if Melford Stevenson couldn't present to the jury that it was in law possible for them to return a verdict of provocation, there was nothing he could say. It was very dramatic and it was very tragic, really, but that was the law at the time.
The trial lasted 1.5 days and the jury took just 14 minutes to come to their verdict.
Members of the jury, are you agreed upon your verdict?
We are.
Do you find Ruth Ellis guilty or not guilty of murder?
Guilty.
Ruth Ellis, the jury have convicted you of murder. In my view, it was the only possible verdict. The sentence for murder is prescribed by law, and my duty is to pass the sentence.
Don't forget there were a lot of people who also thought this wicked, wicked woman. And there were a great many people in court who felt that. And as is evidenced by the fact that the jury did not bring any recommendation of mercy, which they could have done.
Ruth Ellis was the last woman to hang in Britain. There is no doubt that she fired the shots which killed her lover. She freely confessed to it. But we have pieced together the real story of this crime of passion. It's a picture of a woman on the edge of a nervous breakdown. Violently abused and sorely provoked, she was then ill-served not only by the solicitor who took her case and by her Queen's Counsel, but also by the Home Secretary of the day. He disregarded the evidence which could have saved her. Ruth Ellis should not have suffered the hangman's noose. The glamour model of popular imagination in truth came from an unhappy and dysfunctional family which lived on the edges of poverty in South London. She had 2 brothers and 3 sisters. Her mother, a deeply religious Catholic, was a depressive. Her father was an itinerant musician, forced to take more menial work when music hall fell out of fashion. The family were continuously on the move, eventually settling in Brixton. An embittered and angry man, Ruth's father took out his frustration on his daughters. Her older sister Muriel says he began abusing her at the age of 10.
While my mother was away, he forced me to sleep with him, and I used to have my back to the back of him, and when he got into bed, I'd be asleep, and I used to wake up, because he used to put his, what can I say? Yes. His penis between my legs and press my legs down together tight, and then he used to perform.
Her father's abuse did not stop there. Muriel was pregnant by the age of 14.
He tied me up on a chair with my legs back, and that's how he performed.
And that's how you became pregnant?
That's how I became pregnant. I'd only had a period once before that time. Well, she said, you haven't been out, who is this? And so I had to tell her, and she didn't believe me.
You actually told her what? That your father
I used to say it was Daddy.
Her mother then failed to protect Ruth from her father.
Well, Ruth told me Daddy tried to put his thingy, she called it, between her legs and all that, and tried to perform on her, and he kept tight to her till he'd satisfied himself. So, but she didn't say it like that, she just said he kept hanging on to her.
Today, such abuse would certainly be relevant to Ruth's defence of provocation, so we asked a leading criminal psychiatrist, Dr. Gillian Mezzi, to assess Ruth's mental state. Her evidence has been used to defend successfully women who've killed their partners. She has pieced together Ruth's life of abuse.
She was certainly physically abused. It sounds as if it was a very unhappy, loveless family to grow up in. And it would have, I think, created, if you like, a backdrop to the later series of abusive relationships she entered into.
A teenager when war broke out, Ruth enjoyed the arrival of Allied troops in London. By the time she was 17, she had an illegitimate son by a Canadian soldier.
She was in love with him, so much in love with him, it was unbelievable.
But he let her down.
He did, because when he went back to Canada, he sent her 24 roses, and I love you and all that, and I'll be back. But he never came back. My mother wrote to someone in connection with the Canadian soldiers and found out that he was married, said married with 3 children. That was that. They'd never even told him. They just let us know that he was married with 3 children. That completely finished Ruth.
The childhood experiences and the ending of her first real love affair would have created in her an expectation, really, that this is the way that relationships are going to go for her, and perhaps she doesn't deserve any better.
Ruth now had a young son, Andre, to support, and she was desperate to escape the drudgery of life in South London.
We both worked at the Oxo factory for a while, and we both walked out on that job because it wasn't good enough for Ruth. I went to train for munitions, and she went to work at the Lions Cafe.
Money and the glamorous life were what Ruth craved. Where she was aiming was show business, or something like it. The Camera Club had a slightly seedy reputation because it enabled groups of men to take glamour photographs. The club didn't encourage pornography, but could not prevent private arrangements between photographers and models. For some, like Ruth, these sessions were the first step towards prostitution.
I've seen pictures of her, which my father liked. I don't know what happened to them. I saw them.
So he didn't mind her?
And they were lovely pictures too, in the nude. Sitting and posing in the nude. She really knew how to do it, you know.
Ruth became a hostess at a club run by Maury Conley. It wasn't quite as innocent as her sister now wants to believe.
He gave her the job as nightclub hostess, where she had to walk around and talk to the people and introduce people to each other, and she did, and sometimes she worked behind the bar, but it wasn't very often. She was just the nightclub hostess.
This was effectively prostitution, but Ruth could gloss it as taking presents from boyfriends. She enthusiastically embraced her new life.
Mayfair has opened its heart out to me, and I owe it all to Maury Conley. Hostess, don't you know? On £20 a week. Sometimes more. I only earned £2 in the Oxo factory. The girls always said I was too clever for them. Hostess, not tart. That's what I am. There can be no harm. We're all adults. I wouldn't do it if I didn't fancy them. There's no harm in it, really. I'm not hurting anyone.
At the club, she met an older man, George Ellis. He was a dentist, but also a drunk. Nevertheless, Ruth married him. Unfortunately, when he drank, he became violent.
George, he tortured her. He used to put her in a room, put the key in his pocket and bash her to death nearly. He was a right rotter. He was an alcoholic right from the word go. He was in and out psychiatry.
George Ellis was treated for alcoholism at Warlingham Park Hospital, but Ruth was convinced that his frequent visits were not for treatment, but because he was having an affair. She pursued him there and created such a scene that she was prescribed antidepressants, which she continued to take for the rest of her life. By 1953, Ruth had left George Ellis and returned to the bright lights of London and her old ways as a hostess.
Nice suit.
The wife doesn't know.
Don't tell her, she doesn't know, won't hurt it.
David?
You must. What are we doing in this den of vice? I suppose they all like to be known as hostesses.
Who's this pompous little ass?
You're another of them, I suppose.
No. As a matter of fact, I'm an old has-been.
Come on, boys. Let's get out of this sink of iniquity.
If you ask me, that boy's a little too big for his own boots.
David Blakely was a 24-year-old ex-public schoolboy when he met Ruth, who was now the manageress of the little club. His only interests appear to have been women, drink and motor racing. His wealthy stepfather indulged his passion for cars, although he was markedly unsuccessful as a driver. Blakely never won a race.
He was a great mouthpiece. He'd have a, you know, he'd say, if a bird he wasn't a bad-looking bloke, you see, and if a bird looked at him, he'd think, that's not bad, and off he went.
I met him once at the bar in the little club, and he had these great big eyes, and he had a face, an expressionless face. It didn't show any character. It showed just a weakness. She said, what do you think of him? Muriel, I said, oh, I don't know, Ruth, he's not your sort. She said, oh, he's nice. I said, well, maybe he is. But I said, anybody that flirts around like him is no good. Why'd you bother with him?
Blakely became a fixture at the club. Before long, they were lovers, and he moved into her flat. But this didn't prevent Ruth from continuing her daytime liaisons with clients. Nevertheless, their affair was deeply passionate.
He used to say, look, my fiancée runs a club down the road, the little club. Why don't you come down, we'll have a snort. They used each other, really. She was happy for him to bring all the racing drivers into the club and enjoy it. She liked the racing crowd. He liked drinking for nothing and living on for nothing up there and that sort of thing. And I think he, and as I said, she was a great character, but of course he chased other birds, you know, and that sort of thing as well. And that's probably some of the reasons the rows went on, I expect.
Ruth? Ruth, I want to speak to you straight away.
Just a minute. I'm busy. I'm speaking to Brian.
Now! Do you know where I've been? Shut up!
You'd arrive there one night and say, where's David? And they'd say, oh, he's gone off, he's had a row with Ruth or something like that. And you'd go to a meeting and David, is Ruth coming today? No, they've had a punch-up, you know, they're not, and that sort of thing. Those little things we knew.
He knew how to get round a woman. He was used to women. He was a horrible man. She chucked him out once or twice, but then he always came back. And he was a bit of a crybaby. Well, he was a crybaby, he don't cry. And he would apologise to her and promise her the earth. And she forgave him, always forgave him.
Even though he was also violent towards her?
Yes, even though he knocked her to pieces.
Blakely had fitted the pattern of perpetrators of domestic violence in that after each violent episode, he'd come back to her, he told her he loved her, he bought her gifts, he'd said sorry, he promised it would never happen, and he'd raised her hopes again to believe in him and to believe in their relationship.
I don't know whether I love him or I'm going mad.
Did you manage any sleep, Ruth?
No, my ankle hurts.
Have some breakfast. It'll make you feel better. Then I'll run you down to the hospital.
No. I want to go to Penn to get an apology from that bastard.
If I'm driving you all the way over there, we'd better be sure he's there. Why don't you ring?
Good morning. Can I speak to David Blakely, please?
I'm afraid Mr. Blakely is not available.
What do you mean he's not available? Is he there?
Give me the phone. It would be to Mr. Blakely's own good to answer the call.
Mr. Blakely is not taking any calls this morning.
The coward won't even speak to me.
Desmond Cousin was the other man in Ruth's life. He was seriously smitten with Ruth. They become lovers in June 1954, while David Blakely was away racing at Le Mans. Their unusual love triangle was alluded to by Blakely in a postcard he sent her. At first he may just have been teasing, but his mood soon darkened.
He was always wanted her to be with him and not to speak to Desmond, and they became to hate each other so much.
David Blakely's life on the racing circuit gave him plenty of opportunity to take other lovers. He had many, and this fueled Ruth's insecurities. She may have had her own affairs, but she was beside herself at the thought of David's unfaithfulness. Sex and jealousy was the key to their destructive relationship. With Desmond Cousin it was different. It was not just about sex. He offered a security and a sort of protection. After losing her home above the club, Cousin paid the rent on her new flat and looked after her son, including paying his school fees. David discovered this and was furiously jealous. Their fights were always followed by passionate reconciliations, but with each row, David became more violent. In March 1955, 2 months pregnant with a child that Ruth thought would bring them together, they rowed again.
He said he could just about manage 7 shillings a week for our baby. There are cheapskates, and there are cheapskates. I think I've met the cheapest of skates. He'll never marry me. He thinks I'm a common tart. I told him he was no good. Then he punched me in the tummy. Now I can't stop bleeding. And he's gone.
This was a child that perhaps could have cemented the relationship. It could have brought them together. She had great hopes, I would have thought, in the pregnancy and what this child would have represented. The fact that not only Blakely kills the child indirectly, but then leaves her and is apparently lacking in remorse, lacking any kind of recognition of what he has done, would have been devastating.
Whenever Blakely left Ruth, he would seek shelter with Carol and Aunt Findlater, later described in court as odd people. Ruth believed they were determined to break her and David apart. Blakely and Carol had been lovers, even though Aunt was Blakely's best friend and was employed as his mechanic on his racing car, the Emperor. This peculiar relationship tortured Ruth. Despite the mutual antagonism, the foursome took the Emperor to a race meeting near Chester a week before Easter. The trip was a disaster. The car blew up in practice and never even made it to the starting line. Ruth, still bleeding from her miscarriage, fell ill with a heavy cold. After returning to London, Blakely sent her a photo promising love ever after. Ruth convinced herself that all would be well.
Ruth used to say we're going to get married and we'd love each other and that sort of thing, and we knew it was all bullshit. You know, he was using her, let's put it that way.
Blakely promised Ruth he would spend Easter with her. She waited, but he didn't turn up. Still distraught after the miscarriage, she persuaded Desmond Cousin to help her pursue him because she feared he'd finally decided to end the relationship for good. Cousin dropped her outside the Findlaters' house where David was hiding.
I want this woman away from here. She's disturbing us. I want to be left in peace. She's pushed in the windows of that car, which belongs to my guest, David Blakely.
This car's just as much mine as his. I've been living with him for 2 years. I'll stay here until I see him. I'll pay for the damage.
Mr. Blakely won't see her, so it's no use her waiting.
Madam, I suggest you leave this vicinity now.
Ruth did not sleep. She'd become obsessed with the idea that the Findlaters had succeeded in taking Blakely from her.
Hello, Anthony Findlater here.
I hope you're having an enjoyable holiday. because you've ruined mine. David!
The way it would be understood now is that there was a gradual build-up of extreme distress and tension, and there was a delay because of this slow burning fuse, and it was only at that last moment that she suddenly lost control and killed him. The cold and detached, almost dazed quality that's described in the notes is very characteristic of somebody who is extremely traumatized. You have to take into account the fact she had been abused, certainly during her childhood, during her first marriage, and more latterly by Blakely. Like many victims of abuse, this was a woman who did not want to show the world what she was suffering.
I just could not believe that she was capable of shooting anybody. I just couldn't believe it, and I thought, you know, it's unbelievable that she shot Blake. Mind you, I could understand maybe shooting Blakely, but I couldn't understand her shooting anybody. And, you know, where does she get the gun, you know?
The murder was extremely brutal. The autopsy pictures reveal that. But the pathologist report prepared for Ruth's trial also revealed something about David. In his pockets they found speed and poppers. If Ruth Ellis was not to forfeit her life for taking her lover's life so brutally, the defence had to demonstrate vividly the scale of the provocation she'd suffered at David Blakely's hands. Had they succeeded, it is possible that the judge or the jury would have urged mercy. The defence called a psychiatrist to reveal the true extent of her psychological disturbance. Things did not start off well when he antagonized the judge.
The hysterical reaction symptom, whether it is hysterical paralysis or loss of memory, is always a solution to some intolerable problems. And although this causes suffering, the patient does appear to bear it with quite remarkable equanimity, as the symptom has already solved the improbable, if not the intolerable problem.
I'm not quite sure that I understood that.
Well, when a person is in the firing line and is removed from the firing line...
I thought we were talking about women. What has the firing line got to do with a woman? If you want to talk about men, very well, but I thought we were talking about this woman.
Matters were made worse when the doctor conceded in cross-examination that Ruth wasn't excessively disturbed.
Dr. Whittaker, you regard her as being somewhat emotionally immature?
Yes.
From the psychological point of view, somewhat of a hysteric?
Yes, but not a gross hysteric.
I said somewhat of a hysteric.
Yes.
Dr. Whittaker, in whom the defence put their faith as a psychiatrist, examined Ruth for, what, 2 hours? Do you think that was sufficient to the task?
Well, it's always difficult to criticise colleagues, of course, but 2 hours is a sort of period that one would expect you would spend with somebody who's charged with burglary, not with somebody who, where the stakes are so high and who stands to lose their life if the case goes against them.
There were other significant flaws in her defence. Desmond Cousin, her other lover, the last man to see Ruth before the murder, could have told the court all about her true state that evening. The prosecution led him to the moment when he was supposed to have parted from Ruth.
That evening, did you drive her back to Edgerton Gardens? Yes? About what time?
About 7:30.
At 7:30 on the Sunday evening. And that's the last you saw of her?
Yes.
When it came to their turn, the obvious question was not asked by Ruth's defence.
You have told the jury that you and this young woman were lovers for a short time in June 1954. Is that right?
Yes.
And that was a time when Blakely was away, was it not? At the Le Mans race in France?
Yes.
Melford Stevenson missed his opportunity. He did not ask about Ruth's state of mind, a crucial plank of their defence.
I don't know whether I love him or I'm going mad.
That statement would have been a gift for the defence if they had used it. I mean, it certainly indicates the state of emotional turmoil she was in. And it was particularly important because in the dock she appeared composed, calm, controlled. So to give that counterbalancing view would have been very, very helpful.
This wasn't the only criticism levelled at Ruth's QC. John Bickford, her solicitor, felt that Stevenson failed effectively to bring out all the sadness of Ruth Ellis's story. Before the trial, Bickford had sent to counsel a list from A to Z of her problems. His points were strikingly similar to those made by psychiatrists today dealing with battered women's syndrome, but many were never mentioned at trial.
What was his attitude towards you in relation to the club?
Ruth was desperate that the Findlaters face hostile questioning. Melford Stevenson didn't do this. As a result, Ruth felt let down and was uncooperative.
He described it as tarting round the bar.
And seemed to be deliberately undermining her own defence.
By October 1954, was there a further change in his behaviour toward you? How did he treat you physically?
He was violent on occasions.
What sort of violence?
It was always because of jealousy at the bar. At the end of the evenings, when we got upstairs, it was always about things that he'd been seeing me do, and so on and so forth.
How did the violence manifest itself?
He only used to hit me with his fists and hands, but I bruised very easily.
Ruth Ellis, the sentence of the court upon you is that you be taken from this place to a lawful prison and thence to a place of execution, and that you there suffer death by hanging.
Ruth was committed to Holloway to await the death sentence. There was little surprise when her solicitor John Bickford announced there would be no appeal.
An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. If you do any wrong, you have to pay for it. And we believed it. We really believed it.
However, Ruth's death sentence had stirred up the public debate over capital punishment. Abolitionists couldn't believe that a mother would be allowed to hang. They also hoped that by encouraging her reprieve, the penalty itself would be done away with. Others intervened more directly. Her closest friend, Jackie Dyer, ran a personal crusade to save Ruth. She wrote to the Home Office and sought help from her Member of Parliament. Labour MP George Rogers was a convinced abolitionist. He'd campaigned to clear the name of Timothy Evans, hanged in 1950.
Why won't you let me approach the Home Secretary and ask for clemency? Don't you want to carry on living?
No, I want to die.
But that's wrong. How can you say that? You believe in life after death, don't you? You know you won't be with Blakely after you die if you don't live on and expiate your crime. Don't you believe in God? If you did, you'd have the will to carry on. And what will happen to your son after you die? Who will look after him?
I have no wish or desire to live. Andrea's been taken proper care of.
Well, how do you know that? He might not be. And if you die, there will be no one there to look after him. You will be dead and he will be motherless.
What if you do ask for clemency and it fails? I shall still be in the same place.
I never fail.
For the first time, Ruth wavered. She spent the rest of her days veering between a desire to die and a hope she'd be spared.
It's only some time after the killing and before she's executed, that facade begins to break, that you begin to see a woman who is extremely distressed, extremely frightened, and extremely troubled by what she's done.
Her fate now rested with the Conservative Home Secretary Gwilym Lloyd George, son of the former Prime Minister. He had a deeply undistinguished time at the Home Office. It was up to him whether to recommend mercy. Although one other woman had already been hanged during his watch, the defence hadn't given up hope.
I thought she'd be reprieved. I didn't think she would be hanged. That was my opinion. I mean, I know a lot of opinion of the time was, well, this was a very brutal killing in a very public place and so on, and there wasn't much of that in London in those days, and therefore it was a very fierce murder. But I felt that there were too many circumstances surrounding the individual and how their relationship together, which should have permitted, in my view, the Home Secretary to reprieve, and I thought he would.
By combing through the archives of the Home Office, we can reveal how the Home Secretary came to his decision. The case for a reprieve was meant to be assessed on the facts of the case, but Lloyd George undermined the impartiality of this procedure with his political conviction that this hanging should happen. He wrote, "If a reprieve were granted in this case, we should have seriously to consider whether capital punishment should be retained as a penalty." One of the civil servants who was advising him was his Assistant Permanent Under Secretary of State, Philip Allen. He thought this process should be above politics.
Well, I dealt with the case in the same way as I dealt with other murder cases. It was preparing a submission for the Home Secretary and making a recommendation. He would apply his mind quite conscientiously to this without any political input.
But he also said, and I quote, "If a reprieve is granted in this case, we should seriously have to consider whether capital punishment should be retained as a penalty." Does that not indicate that he was thinking beyond this particular case?
No, I don't think so.
But in fact, politics did matter enormously. It wasn't simply the life of Ruth Ellis that was at stake, it was the future of the death penalty itself. The Home Secretary and the abolitionists could agree on one thing. Ruth's crime was so dreadful that if she were spared, it would be difficult to justify hanging any woman. It was against this backdrop that new evidence was dismissed. The fact is, Ruth Ellis had an accomplice, her other lover, Desmond Cousin.
And remarkably, this new evidence had been presented to the Home Office by Jacqueline Dyer on the 25th of June, 2 weeks before Lloyd George said the death sentence should go ahead. She told them Desmond Cousin gave Ruth the gun and drove her to the murder.
I'm sure that what Ruth did was all done through Cousin's egging her on and driving her up the wall so much.
Cousin's involvement was never properly investigated. If it had been, Ruth might have been saved. The problem was Ruth had told the police that someone else had given her the gun. They had never believed her, but while she stuck to her story, their suspicions of Cousin's involvement could not be proved. The new allegations were reason enough for the police to reopen the case, but they were not encouraged to do so because the Home Office didn't think Cousin's involvement was directly relevant. They concluded this 2 days after receiving Dyer's letter and before they handed it to the police to investigate. But one man had known all along that Cousin had been Ruth's accomplice. Ironically, Ruth and Cousin had both separately told John Bickford. He knew that this was crucial evidence, even though he'd been asked not to mention it. He never did, until shortly before his death, and his failure to do so rested heavily on his conscience till the day he died.
Bickford must think I'm stupid. He and Desmond are perfectly happy for me to be in here. I'm not playing this game. I'll have nothing more to do with him. Perhaps after I die, the truth will be told.
After Ruth sacked Bickford, she turned to the Brixton firm of solicitors which had handled her divorce from George Ellis. The solicitor was Victor Mishcon, who was a prominent London Labour politician. He and his clerk had just 1 day to save Ruth.
I dashed to see Mr. Bickford when I got this request from her and asked him, was there anything that she hadn't said which I might persuade her to say, which would be to her advantage? And he said to me, well, nobody really has cleared up the mystery of the gun that she used. And I took that as being something that I could possibly work on in connection with an application for a reprieve, and I dashed to the prison. She greeted Mr. Simmons and I as though she was a social hostess superintending a cocktail party. It was quite amazing. It was like seeing an actress on the stage almost. She said very clearly, very precisely, and without her voice faltering at all, I have taken a life, and my life is forfeit for it. So the question of applying for a reprieve didn't appeal to her at all. As I said, she said, coming out of prison in some years' time, what, looking like an old hag? No, thank you.
But you pressed on.
I did. And the only way we managed to persuade her, Mr. Simmons and I, in the end, and it was quite a battle, was, didn't she owe it to her son that he should know the truth? And then she did give way.
She finally told the story of what happened before the murder. She'd spent the afternoon drinking Pernod with cousin, and he had given her the gun.
We're nearly there, Ruth.
I've got to find David. There's no alternative. If I don't kill him, he'll kill me.
She said, I haven't said any of this before, and she used the word I remember so well, it would have been traitorous. I remember that word so well. But this was the truth.
She was protected.
Undoubtedly.
But there was no reason, she gave no reason why.
She gave no reason why, except that she was facing what she did. Why bring somebody else punishment when it wasn't necessary?
For the first time, Ruth admitted that she'd lied about where the gun had come from. She revealed to Victor Mishcon the full extent of Cousin's involvement. In effect, she was saying he aided and abetted the murder of David Blakely. Mishcon realized the significance of her statement, but time was running out.
Mr. Mishcon. Not this way, sir. Mr. Mishcon. What did she say? It's the hang-in, officer. A few words, please. Sir.
Dashed to the Home Office, hoping to see, obviously, the permanent secretary. He, unfortunately, or otherwise, was at the race course.
But he left a message that the police could get hold of him. This turned out to be the simple expedient of bawling his name out over the loudspeakers on Ascot Heath, which made him rather cross. Anyway, he came to the telephone, and I said he'd better come back straight away.
What they learned was that there was enough evidence to charge Cousin, but Mishcon was anxious not to be seen as part of a political campaign against hanging, so he kept the press in the dark.
I'm sure you understand one cannot be too careful, and this is a situation in which there is a life at stake. More I cannot say.
Look at me, sir.
If the facts were as she stated in her statement, then Cousins, in my view, might well have been charged as a principal, let alone accessory before the fact.
If Cousins had given her the gun, then he knew fine that she was drunk and disturbed after her miscarriage. He would have been culpable.
Yes, if all those facts came out to provide someone in that condition with a weapon, loaded weapon, certainly would have been.
If statements of this kind were submitted to us, they wouldn't simply have been put on one side. We would have considered them very carefully. And by we, I include both the Home Secretary and Sir Frank Newson, the head of the office. You may say we came to the wrong conclusion. I don't know. Perhaps we did.
Why then was Cousin not immediately charged? We have discovered the Home Office received a secret memo from the prison officer who'd been in the cell with Ruth and Victor Mishcon. The officer's report contradicted what Mishcon had told them. Crucially, she said the use of the gun was Ruth's idea. The Home Office chose to believe the prison officer and not the lawyer, and worse, didn't even bother to check with him, despite thinking the difference was important.
I understand Sir Frank Newson said, though, that this was an illuminating bit of information.
Again, having seen the documents only recently, and I'm looking at Sir Frank Newson's own handwriting, the discrepancy between the officer's report and Mr. Mishkon's statement is interesting and illuminating. Well, with great respect, we didn't allow much time for the light to illuminate.
Philip Allen did at least phone the police to tell them about the new evidence. He told them to find Cousin. Ruth had just 16 hours to live. From lurking in the background, Cousin now looked like he was deeply involved in Blakely's murder. To prosecute him, they would need Ruth as a witness. But with no temporary stay of execution, the authorities were about to kill their witness. The police failed to find Cousin. Indeed, he may have gone to ground following a tip-off from the newspapers that Victor Mishkon had new evidence.
A Home Office announcement says that Major Lloyd George has decided that there are no sufficient grounds to justify him in recommending any interference with the due course of law.
Their hunt lasted a mere 8 hours, from 4:30 in the afternoon until midnight, when they were instructed to stop.
The only inquiry after Cousin to see whether this could be corroborated or not was limited to a matter of a few hours with a brief note that he couldn't be found. I've no wonder he couldn't be found in a matter of hours, but why not try for days in a matter of this kind?
So, sadly for Ruth, the one group of people to whom the Home Secretary would have listened had concluded wrongly that Ruth's statement was not new evidence. Without their urging a delay, the Home Secretary was free to exercise his own prejudices.
Lloyd George made these clear when he said, if she isn't hanged tomorrow, she never will be. So it was no surprise that he announced there would be no temporary reprieve. He was not prepared to grant Ruth Ellis the chance of life.
If there had been a temporary stay, do you think Ruth Ellis would have eventually hanged or not?
That's pure speculation. I just don't know. If it had involved a prolonged delay and a lot of further inquiries, I think probably not.
I can understand politically he might have been correct, because if there had been a period allowed for these inquiries to be made, I think the public outcry would be such that it would have been very difficult to refuse a reprieve. But really, should politics enter into this, or only the law and possibly mercy?
There was to be no mercy. The Home Secretary resolved that the law should take its course, but her new solicitor never gave up hope.
I just frankly waited by that telephone until the early hours of the morning, when I got the sad news that the application had been rejected.
And I thought sadness, I thought a modern tragedy of a girl who had been led into this life and got involved in a shoddy, squalid life. I'd hoped she would be reprieved, but she wasn't, and I felt sad.
Demonstrators massed outside Holloway Prison in support of Ruth, who would become the last woman hanged this century, and possibly the last woman this country will ever hang. Some of her family attended to say goodbye. Muriel waited at home.
Well, I can only remember what I did. The children didn't know, and I ran up and down the stairs, in and out of the rooms. Couldn't believe it. I thought perhaps they'd hide her and make out they'd done it. Couldn't believe it. It was, unless you go to it, you can't begin to understand it.
Unknown to the other prisoners, the executioner Albert Pierrepoint made his quiet entrance to begin his gruesome preparations. He set up his scaffold and secretly observed Ruth to gauge her build and calculate the length of the drop. The prison clock was stopped.
I am feeling all right. The time is 7:00 a.m.
Ruth woke early to write her final letter.
I have told the truth. And that is all I can do. Thank you. Once again. And
she may have been reconciled to her fate, but her death is difficult to reconcile with justice.
I gradually became a convinced abolitionist, having dealt with a number of these cases. And it didn't seem to me to be right that an individual's life should be taken. But we had to operate on the basis of what the law was. The law said that the punishment for murder is death by hanging.
I had a right to kill David, but I believe what it says in the Bible, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. I don't mind dying. I just want the truth told. So I must hang. How else can I join David?
The solicitors acting for Ruth Ellis's sister have now sent the evidence from this programme to the Criminal Cases Review Commission, who look into miscarriages of justice. It will decide in the new year whether the appeal court should consider overturning Ruth Ellis's conviction for murder.